Welcome everyone to another in our series of Noya Center Science Talks. And tonight we're super excited to welcome underwater photographer Pat Webster, who many of you probably know as Underwater Pat on his socials. And Pat is based down in Monterey Bay area, but his career includes work with Seymour Marine Discovery Center, Monterey Bay Aquarium, Nature Conservancy, and a long list of other organizations. His storytelling through his extraordinary photography and uniquely descriptive style is really unparalleled, really beautiful. And with that, Pat, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you so much, Trey. Thank you to the Noyo Center. Hello, everybody joining here on the Zoom. I see a few of your lovely faces, um, but not all of them at the moment because I have multiple screens going here to show this footage. But just for the folks that are there, maybe a thumbs up or something that you can see this video and that it's playing for all of you right now. It's looking good. Got
Yes.
the video. Beautiful. And people can hear me, which obviously you can feel free to mute me or exit out of this presentation at any time in case I become a little bit too much for everybody. But yes, thanks so much for joining me. Thank you to the Noya Center for always for the friendship to myself and to other kelp cultists. I am one of many folks up and down the coast that found their muse diving out here in these kelp cathedrals out here in the cold water of California. I happen to be in Monterey Bay, but if you want to put it in the chat so I can read later, if you just want to let me know where y'all are coming in from on this Zoom call, or where you found your first little bit of kelp in your life that really got you excited about these incredible, incredible super seaweeds. So I put this, I was just talking to Trey a little bit. I do a lot of different talks. My main job is to work as a diving naturalist aboard the National Geographic Lindblad Expeditions cruise ships. So I get to travel around the world now to see various places that I never thought I would be able to go. And it's kind of all through kelp photography that got me there, because where there is kelp, there's cold water, and where there's cold water, is where there's usually a lot of frozen hands and very challenging diving. And so all of that training just to go out and see these views. This is filmed off of Monastery Beach in my backyard, and the background on Trey on his Zoom is Monastery Beach. And then this bit of kelp behind me is also Monastery Beach, about 15 minutes from my house. And the training, it turns out, to go diving in my backyard is the same type of training that you needed to do to be able to dive in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, in cold water around the world. And all around the world, where it's cold, the corals give way to the kelps, and you get these scenes. And actually, you might recognize this particular video was featured in the new Netflix Our Oceans, narrated by Barack Obama. And a fun little thing about this clip is that the former president says that the kelp can grow from 150 feet deep, and that is actually incorrect. This particular kelp grows about from 70 feet deep, but grows 150 feet long. So now a claim to fame for me forever is that I have a video of my local kelp forest on Netflix with a former president misstating a scientific fact about kelp on top of it. So I'm very, very proud of that. It kind of feels like on brand for me to have to like come back in and like re-explain, excuse me, Mr. President, but actually the kelp doesn't grow from that deep, but it is that big. Okay, so most of the photography that I have here, I threw together today. I wanted to make sure it's as fresh as possible. This Saturday, I head off to Antarctica again, and there are seaweeds down there. So I put a whole bunch of photos in here. So we're just going to get through this presentation together as I try to get everybody to send kelp, some sweet seaweed scenery from several seas with Yabui, Patrick Webster. Everything that I'm going to show you here is from myself, filmed. I'll try to tell you where it is. And then for all of you here, Noyo Center, oh, that should be the 29th instead of the 28th right there on screen. Okay, let's move on. So if you take nothing away from this presentation, other than the kelp cult is strong, Trey may still have some merch over at the Noya Center. This is the Kelp Wanted shirt from the exhibition that I did with Abby Diaz. So that's still there. But if you get nothing else out of this presentation, it's number one, that kelps create cold water communities because corals are cowards, question mark. But basically, the further north you go, the further south you go, as you leave the tropics and the subtropics, you start to get a different type of photosynthetic life where light creates a community for itself to live within. In the tropics, it's inside corals. Corals are animals that have photosynthetic symbiotic algae that live inside of them. They're called zooxanthellae, but basically they ingest solar panel friends that live inside their bodies, and that's what creates the whole community in a coral reef. But once you go away from the coral reef community, then you have kelps, you have seaweeds, you have algae. Seaweed writ large is going to be red, green, and brown algae, which are not closely related at all to each other. It turns out brown, red, green algae do their own thing phylogenetically. But kelp, I'm specifically going to be referring to our brown algae, like the giant kelp behind me, like the one that's on screen. We're going to see a lot of brown algae. And those kelps, by taking the sun and the carbon from around them and building up these structures, they're not only food for a lot of animals. That's like kind of an obvious thing, like, oh, you've got this plant thing growing, so things are going to eat it, but it also creates its own habitat, its own structure, its own environment for things to live in. So kelps are creating their own community, their own environment. Where there's kelp, there's a completely different style of animal. Then the algal amphitheaters are awesome and admirable. So these things are incredible to dive in. It's my favorite environment to dive in anywhere in the world. I can say that now. That diving in a kelp forest is my favorite thing on the planet. I've dove in Indonesia, in Hawaii, in the Mediterranean. I've dove in fjords in Alaska where there is no kelp and all these things. Where there's kelp is my favorite thing. It's a three-dimensional environment. It's an area where you get to live out your childhood fantasy of being a bird and flying through the forest or flying over an ecosystem. But there in the kelp, you are the bird. You're weightless and you get to just fly around, three dimensions all around you. It's a kelp cathedral, basically. It's my favorite place. So they're not only awesome, but they're also admirable. They do a lot of important stuff for the coastline. They mitigate how currents run, where animals settle. They're a habitat for fisheries, for other animals to grow up inside of, for sea otters to wrap themselves up inside of, for seals and sea lions or baby salmon or everything to just intermix in place. So they are something to really be in awe of, to be astounded by, that these things are right off the coast. We don't get to see them usually, but you may see something on a plate that you enjoy eating, or you may see a whale go by and you're like, oh, that's an incredible whale. And that whale is actually going to be connected to the kelp in some real way on its transition. And by ancestral, the kelp forests, they've been around here along the coasts and moving around as the continents do, from Pangaea, Gondwanaland, everything. Kelp has been around for a while, but it's ancestral to the peoples of the coast because you may have heard of the kelp highway hypothesis, where instead of using the land bridge hypothesis to explain how people come to live in the Americas all the way down south to Patagonia, coming in from Siberia and coming in from Asia, it actually makes a ton of sense that if you're going from Korea, northern China, Russia, you can just go all the way across the Aleutians, all the way down into Mexico, skipping on over into Ecuador, and then all the way down to Patagonia along the coast. And you really don't have to change much about how your life works, because you've got salmon runs or fish runs that are happening along those areas, trouts and so on. You've got these seaweeds, you've got this temperate environment. So the kelp highway is actually one big way that we now think people have made their way along the coasts, because if you go from one side of the Pacific all the way down to the tip of the Atlantic, looking out into towards Africa, you really don't have to change anything about how you live your life from there all the way down to survive along a kelp coastline. So the kelp highway is a reason for us being here along the coastline, and especially for the ancestral peoples of the coastline. Okay, so then the final thing, and I'm already at 10 minutes, dear Lord. The water woods, they wow when wondrous, and they make you wince when they're wrecked. So they're incredible when they're gone. Most people on the shore won't even know that there was or was not a kelp forest where they happen to be. It's one of the things about the ocean is that no matter how healthy um, or how damaged it is, it tends to look the same from the beach. The only thing you may notice is that there's no more canopy. If you're a kelp cultist, you may notice, hey, where's my garden out there? And so I'll show you some scenes of what it looks like when the kelp is gone, and it's obviously not as beautiful as that. But don't worry, we will win with work to get the kelp back. Plenty of people are working on it. It's going to happen. Okay, so with those alliterative slides where I talked about a whole bunch of different things and theories and way too quickly already, I'm going to try to slow myself down. I apologize for going so quick. But this next part is sort of easy to talk about because it's me that we're going to talk about real quick. This is a short history of Underwater Pat. That's me. This is my dad holding on to me in the subway of London when I was a kid. I was born in France and I went to high school outside of Stockholm, Sweden. I am a missionary kid and a pastor's son. I'm also a middle child and the only boy. So if that explains any of the brain stuff you may have noticed about how much I like to talk, be the center of attention, having all of you people here to listen to me and look at my kelp photos. It's because I have craved this moment and the attention of people ever since I was a wee lad. As you can see, I'm very awkward, very shy, not too interested in being on camera or talking to anybody about anything. So when I was a kid, I grew up in a very conservative Christian evangelical background where the earth was created as the Bible put it. And then I made my way out of that line of thinking as I started to think, okay, well, I need to know how the world really works. And so as I went off into studying the planet, I really wanted to be a marine biologist. And ever since I was 5 years old, I saw sea otters at the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California, and I wanted to be a marine biologist and work there. But so kind of leaving my family for a while, trying to think on my own, I wound up at UC Santa Cruz, a young man really lost, not really knowing who I am anymore, what I'm about. But what I did know was that my name was Patrick, and that there is a very famous starfish named Patrick in SpongeBob SquarePants. And so I figured I could lean into that character. So here's me with Patrick. I learned later not to take these out of the tide pools. But this is me showing up on the shores of California, first time living in the United States, not really knowing who or what to do, except I'm going to be a marine biologist and I'm going to work for the Monterey Bay Aquarium. That's all I knew. I had never been diving, never been surfing, never been in the ocean. Then I realized, hey, marine biology is pretty cool. Here's me trying to nurse a baby doll's porpoise back to health. This was my first time ever wearing a wetsuit. And there I am walking around with a little baby doll's porpoise. So I was like, okay, this is pretty sweet. And as a lot of young, naive, impressionable marine biology youths, I thought, well, marine mammals have to be the only thing in the ocean, right? So I'm going to do marine mammal biology. That's what I'm going to do. Here's me trying to grow facial hair very adorably on a beach in Año Nuevo with a bunch of baby elephant seals. And I realized that I was really, really bad at being a quote, real scientist, where I'm out on the beach counting all of the things, inputting data, doing data analysis, uh, testing hypotheses. I did okay at it academically, but it was not my passion at all. I would much rather you can tell from the smile maybe on the photo, that I'd much rather say little jokes to myself. And in particular, behind me there are a whole bunch of baby elephant seals that have weaned themselves from their parents. And if you're not aware of what that means, is that we call these weaners. And my job was to figure out which sex they were, male or female. And so my job was to sex wieners. And so that I'll still chuckle at it forever. I'll never apologize for how hilarious I thought that job was. But the rest of the people doing this work were like, that's too much. That's enough. We need you to stop making these jokes. And so I decided to turn around, turn my back to the quote real scientists and go directly into this, which is marine science education, interpretation. This is me on Talk Like a Pirate Day at the Seymour Marine Discovery Center with my audience. Here we are just going, "Arr!" and walking around the Seymour Center, just having a lot of fun talking about the ocean, getting kids excited. And there's me embodying Patrick Starfish, kind of finding my way into, oh, I can do performance art, stand-up comedy, marine biology mixture and talk to the larger audience, the one that's not in the classrooms, not in the boardrooms, but just out there interested in learning, but not quite sure what they want to learn. I think you can also see from this photo that my demographic has found itself already, where the kids are terrified of me and 5 steps back, and the mom thinks I'm hilarious. So that's also when I realized maybe education isn't the move, and maybe aiming for an older audience, which ended up being on social media, working for the Monterey Bay Aquarium a few years on from this photo. But on my way, I got sidetracked. When I was in college, I realized, hey, well, everybody who knows what they're talking about is a diver, it seems. I should get into scuba diving. There was good programs at the university. And so there's me in 2009 taking my first checkout dives over at San Carlos Beach. And this basically changed my life. This is out here in Monterey Bay. This is still 10 minutes from my house. I just went diving here last week. It's become the addiction. It's become my religion, effectively. I dove in head first, started going after as much diving as I could. I did the scientific diving class over at UC Santa Cruz. And behind me there is Big Creek that has a mixed bull and giant kelp forest. And it was there that I said, okay, I'm devoting the rest of my time to diving as much as I can. I got into underwater photography from that. And this is a photo. You can actually see the moment where I lost all hope of disposable income going forward, when I thought, hey, taking photos underwater is pretty fun. So this was my first dive over at the Santa Cruz Wharf. And so I just dove in. No matter how hard it hurt, this is my face after being stung by sea nettles, stinging jellyfish for about an hour. People pay a lot of money for those lips now. So I just want to point out that if you know anybody who's looking to get lip filler or Botox or anything, you can really just seize your face in a perfect moment by kissing a sea nettle. So in case you're looking to go the budget route, if you had federal funding or anything before and it's gone anyway, you can just do that. So and then here we are today. This is actually a photo from yesterday out in Monastery Beach in Monterey. Um, Here's what I do now. I'm a part of the Scuba Pro global dive team, going around with National Geographic, taking photos in cold kelpy places. And I never thought that this would be my life. But I just kept wanting to be associated with the kelp. The kelp became the muse. And taking photos of it has led me to be speaking with all of you. So forgetting the marine mammals, kelp is what we're going to talk about for the rest of it. And yeah, just zooming in a little bit, just wanted to point out that is yesterday in Monterey Bay. So like I mentioned, I grew up a missionary kid. I grew up a pastor's son. I grew up going to church. And for the longest time, I couldn't quite get there. I'd be surrounded by people having religious experiences, people connecting to something bigger, people connecting with community, and having this moment of existing on a vibration with the divine. And I was there as a kid just being like, why can't I go home and play video games with my friends? Why am I stuck at church for 12 hours today again? I wish that I could be skiing, or any, just like anything that when you're a kid, you maybe don't quite realize the lesson that you're trying to be taught. But I took away from it that there is something when you find your church, when you find your community. And for me, the first time I ever had a true religious experience of feeling that smallness and that bigness and that connection to everything else, it was looking at a scene very much like this that I saw yesterday, which is the God beams going through the stained glass canopy of the Kelp Cathedral. That put me in my place. That was, okay, this is now what I'm doing. This is what I'm going to be about. And the difficulties that I had with my tradition in church, out of church, what are we all doing? the way that I've been able to reconcile the different parts of my life is that we speak the same language when we talk about the ocean and kelp, or I speak that same language as they do when they're talking about their place in creation. So not to belabor that point, but this for me, that was where I first felt that here we are moment. And so here again, some photos. These are all from yesterday. This is giant kelp. If you're from the North Coast, you might be less familiar with this. It goes up all the way up into Alaska. You'll find giant kelp up there, but it's very infrequent along the North Coast because it tends to need much less surge, much less being slapped in the face by the ocean than other kelps. And it is the second fastest growing plant in the world. And I'm going to say plant interchangeably. We all know it's an alga, but if you don't know, this is effectively like a tree underwater. It's like a redwood in terms of what it does. And these things can grow in prime conditions 18 inches in a day. They can grow to be over 150 feet long, like I mentioned. So outside of bamboo, this is it. This is as fast as light can become something big that forms its own community is giant kelp. And within this community are going to be lots of other organisms. This is some red algae, also known as loofah kelp. This is chondrocanthes, cow's tongue. You can take it, it's very bumpy. You can use it as a loofah. It's very good at exfoliating. And in there is a jeweled top snail. So these images now are for the people who understand that there's more to life than just the kelp, the brown algae. There's the red algae. There's also the sea grasses that are very, very important. These are not algae. These are actually flowering plants that live underwater. This is a sea slug called a melody living on top of eelgrass meadows. So there are forests underwater. There are meadows underwater. There are great plains underwater. They all deserve protection. And right now, what we're basically going to be talking about the rest of this time is the giant redwood tree forests of seaweed, of the kelps. But there are many other ecosystems that involve algae on the seafloor up to the sea surface. But anyway, if there was anybody out there who was like, there's going to be a whole seaweed talk, and we're not even going to talk about red algae or green algae, and he's not even going to show a flowering plant that some people think is algae, but is actually its own thing, eelgrass. I've settled that. I hope we're good. Okay, more photos from yesterday. This is a cabezon, the largest sculpin in our area. Big old predator, loves to eat things like abalone crabs and other fishes. Here I got close to take a photo, and then it took offense to me being so close, and then it took off. Look at this beautiful fish. Come on now. It could be a pregnant female. I think it's got a little bit of a belly bump, but there are so many animals that live in this environment. Absolutely beautiful. We'll never get bored of diving in there. But I point this fish out as a little bit of a teaser for another fish later on. But remember the cabezon. Here is a photo that I took when I first started working for the Monterey Bay Aquarium. I graduated in 2011. I apologize if that's an existential crisis for anybody listening, but I graduated in 2011 from college, and I went to work. I went to work directly for the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where I ended up working for 11 years. And one day I went out snorkeling and I took this photo of the giant kelp under the surface, which is the logo of the Monterey Bay Aquarium. And I had this sort of full circle moment of this is what inspired me to become a marine biologist. And then I found my way into being right off of its back deck, looking at that ecosystem, looking at that environment that is inside those doors, being out there in the real thing. And so here is just some of my favorite photos of kelp, of giant kelp for now, that I've taken. This was taken at the same beach where I learned how to scuba dive. There's something about this growing blade of giant kelp that I like to call visual umami. It's just so satisfying. I never get old. It never gets old to take its photo. But bull kelp has become another thing that I'm really curious about, and the interplay between bull kelp and giant kelp. They mix here in Monterey and up in British Columbia, but very few places in the world. And so here in my backyard, I get to have that little experience of southern kelp forests and northern kelp forests, or open coast kelp forests and lesser open coast kelp forests, all mixing Um, and then I will say that I do get to have a little bit of time with things with backbones that are very charismatic. This is a harbor seal out in the kelp forest of Monastery. Here's a sea lion in the kelp forest off of San Carlos Beach. So I understand if you really do love these marine mammals, these organisms that had evolutionary regrets of crawling out on land and realizing the ocean is where it's at, that's fine. But sometimes we think we'll go whale watching or we'll go, I work with people or I work for people on these cruise ships that are traveling all the way around the world to try to see a whale or try to see this and that. And whales love kelp. And I can prove it to you because they do this fun thing, which is called kelping now and again. So this here is a humpback whale that is diving in the exact same kelp forest that I was just diving in. And you'll see with its tail on this second surface how much it loves a spa day. There it is, covering itself in kelp, right? So they'll rub all over the kelp. It's maybe exfoliating, it's maybe soothing, maybe they just like to do it. But so you'll potentially see a humpback whale in a kelp forest, or you'll see a whale tail made of kelp itself, which is my ode and little homage to that whale on the dive day that we had together. Then zooming in, I just want to point out that I could do a whole other talk on my favorite organisms in the ocean, which are actually the jellies. This here is a hula skirt siphonophore. It's called. It's a colony of jellies. And sometimes the kelp is the perfect backdrop to show off an alien that lives out in the wider ocean. I've had incredible interactions with gelatinous organisms making their way into diving depths into the kelp forest that I'm diving in. So the kelp is not separated from the open ocean, from the jellies, from the whales, from the seals and sea lions, from the birds on the beach. It's integral, and it's also part of your life if you live here on the coast, and certainly now that you're on this call. All right, this seems to be an example of some slides that broke. I try to keep it fresh for everybody. Anyway, that's more detail on a jellyfish on the hula skirt. Okay, moving on. Halfway through, we're finally talking about where kelp is in the world. So here is from the Kelp Forest Alliance. What you're seeing there are all the various places. Just look for the green coastline. That's where you'll find kelp forests, these brown algal forests all around. There's giant kelp in the north and south, in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. There's certain forests that are all understory forests. I'll show you those off of Iceland. And off of Antarctica. But basically, where it gets cold, where there's strong currents, you're going to have these seaweeds growing. Some of them form canopies, so reaching all the way up to the surface. Some of them form subcanopies, only living in that midwater, not reaching the surface. But where it's cold, you have kelp, and kelp is stressed by lots of different things. Herbivores is one of the little things that's on there. Climate change or warming oceans is another one that's on there. Resource extraction, harvesting, fishing, outflow. There's a whole bunch of things that impact the kelp from the ocean side and from the land side, meaning us. So there's that a little bit closer. You can see there's various parts in the world, and each one is impacted differently. That's something else to know, is that kelp is global, but they're not all the same. Everybody in the world is a stone's throw from being associated with kelp, have been forever, but it's not all the same kelp, and it's not all the same environment. It's not all the same effect. For example, if you grew up in California as a mostly, classic white person experience, you're not having a ton of experience with eating of a lot of kelp. But if you go across to the other side into Korea, you're growing up having kelp broth eggs for breakfast and miso soup that has a kombu sugar kelp base. If you're eating nori and sushi and all that, that same type of seaweed, Pyropia, Porphyra, a lot of these seaweeds, they just grow on the coast. And when I'm leading tours in Alaska, for example, I'll point out at low tide, hey, see all that stringy stuff right there? That's nori, that's seaweed wrap, that's sushi wrap right there. And you see people like, well, I love sushi. And I'm like, yeah, well, if you, there it is, there's the kelp. So we may consume a lot of it, but we don't necessarily have the same relationship that if we were in another part of the world or in a different tradition. Historically, the First Nations, the first peoples of these coasts, absolutely cooked with kelp, ate kelp, engaged with kelp in a very different way. So, anyway, that's a plug to eat more kelp in your diet because it's not weird. It's actually what we probably should be doing since we have all this stuff growing that's right out there. Okay, 31 minutes on my screen. We are now traveling around the world. We're going to start off uh, in Alaska. This will be very familiar to you folks that are from the North Coast area. The ecotype of kelp, or the ecotype of the kelp forest that's up there, it's open ocean in certain parts, it's backwater, protected bays, and so the kelp forest will change if you're on the open Pacific side, on the inside passage side, if you're in this one back bay, or if you're in this other part. So the kelp is very dynamic in Alaska, British Columbia, and it depends which side of the world, which side you're on. So this is from the inside passage outside of Glacier Bay, some bull kelp with the beautiful Tongass National Forest up there with a bunch of Sitka spruce and western hemlock. And then here's a similar scene, but in Sitka, so out on the open Pacific side, and here we have some giant kelp. So there's two canopy forming kelps in Alaska, and then here's a third, which is dragon kelp, or Eulalia fistulosa. And fistulosa, like a fistula, it's got a little uh, it's got these little bubbles inside of its midrib. You can maybe see there in this image. The lighter parts are gas bubbles. The floats of giant kelp and bull kelp and this kelp will just, as a quick aside, it's a mixture of oxygen from photosynthesis, carbon dioxide from consuming their own sugars, cell respiration, just like us breathing out carbon dioxide. And every so often, there's a little bit of carbon monoxide in there because they're trying to consume sugars in water. So they may have incomplete cell combustion. They might not burn the sugar fully to create carbon dioxide. But all these canopy forming kelps are using gas bubbles to buoy it up to the surface where the sunlight is. So here is dragon kelp and bull kelp together off of Fox Creek. This is on the inside passage. Here's a little shrimp, a heptacarpus shrimp that's growing on some dragon kelp that's outside of Petersburg, Alaska. And then there's that dragon kelp. And so this is stuff you'll find all the way up into the Aleutians. There are different types of alaria that don't form canopies that you can find all the way down here into California. You'll find them washed up and in the intertidal, but this is the stuff that forms a canopy. And then here is outside of Alaska in a silty environment where you have some understory seaweed with this friend of ours, former friend that used to exist up and down the coast here, of a sunflower star. These are the murderous seafloor Roombas that can have 20 plus arms, move very quickly and devour everything. There's still a lot of areas up in Alaska where they're super abundant, but sea star wasting disease, warming oceans, this is an animal that is starting to suffer up in Alaska as well, and has already disappeared pretty much from Washington down to Mexico. So kind of an endangered or a vulnerable, if not fully endangered species. I forget exactly its status, but up in Alaska, still doing pretty good. Okay, so that's Alaska. That's as far north as I've been able to go on the Pacific side. Haven't made it to the Aleutians yet. I really want to go up there, Prince Rupert, all that. But the furthest north I've gone is just outside of Glacier Bay National Park. So then coming down, we're in the Salish Sea, aka, if you don't know of the name change, the Puget Sound area, Salish Sea, the Salish people that lived all in that area. And then this is a little bit as well, North Coast, British Columbia, near where Haida Gwaii is. But this is bull kelp with a great blue heron standing on top of it, using the floats as a little platform to hunt from. This is right off the breakwater point. You can maybe see the little lighthouse on the right there. looking across to the Olympic range in Washington. This is further north. This is up at the Hakai Institute on Calvert Island. And here's a mix of giant kelp and bull kelp off the coast of British Columbia. This is on the open ocean side. This here is some bull kelp off of the San Juan Islands. This is right next to Friday Harbor. And then here we're back in Victoria with a copper rockfish, some Puget Sound rockfish, some giant plumose anemones or cauliflower anemones, and then towering bull kelp reaching up to the surface with a little bit of understory algae on the right there, some Dictionurum kelps over there. I believe that's what they are. And then this here is a heart crab going for a little surge wild ride atop some laminarial kelp, some of that understory kelp. Really fun friend to find. Lots of crabs on this particular dive. Here's a kelp crab, making sure that its name stays correct in the books. Look, kelp crab, kelp crab, kelp crab. Look, we did it. Okay, so that's for up north. I'm going to skip over Northern California because I'm going to end there. We're going to skip right on down to Baja California, and I apologize for the charismatic megafauna break, but I just had to point out that the gray whales down there are super fun and friendly when they're breeding, and this is one doing a scientific behavior called schnorfeling. I made that up, but look at it, just blowing bubbles at me, staring directly into the GoPro. Anyway, gray whales love kelp because they use the kelp to disguise themselves and their calves so that they don't get predated on by orcas on their migrations. But enough about the gray whales in Baja. There's kelp down there. Here's some giant kelp off of Isla San Martin, which is one of the Mexican Channel Islands. Basically the same continuation from the Channel Islands. Further north, this is one off of Santa Barbara Island in the U.S. waters, but basically there's a few more islands that go straight down the coast into Baja, California, that are effectively more Channel Islands just south of the border. Here it's a little bit different. You've got this horn shark there. We've got these soft corals, these gorgonians that start to show up, and you can start to see the transition from the cold kelp into the warmer coral that's going to take over as you go further south beyond Cabo Pulmo at the southern tip of Baja. Garibaldi, the California state marine fish, is in there. This beautiful orange that they use to be very aware of their aggressive neighbors. Here's one of my favorite little Garibaldi fish moments in a Mexican kelp forest. This is off of San Quintin. If you enjoy tomatoes along the West Coast, they probably came from grow houses off of San Quintin and Baja, if it says from Mexico. And then this is in that same lagoon where the gray whale was in Bahia Magdalena, which is pretty much the furthest south that kelp ends up going. A little bit further south to Isla Cedros, but you're pretty much right there at the edge. And this is some southern sea palm kelp, which you can find here in Monterey. Those little shrimps there are mysid shrimp, which are gray whale food all up and down the coast. And then here's a wild thing for me, just to see butterfly fish and kelp and angelfish and kelp and sergeant majors and kelp. Like that, if you went to Hawaii, you would see basically that same type of fish assemblage on coral, but then here they are with a seaweed backdrop. This blew my mind to do this dive, is like all these fish that I'm used to diving with off of Cabo San Lucas in just blue water, coral environment. Here they are mixing with the kelp that then makes its way all the way north. Okay, moving over into the Atlantic and into Iceland. This is an understory kelp forest, very similar to the one in Baja. The kelp does not reach the surface in Iceland. So if you go on a drive around Iceland on the ring road, it's been kelp the entire way and you have no idea. In fact, one way, in case any of you out there are taking photos of kelp in Iceland, one way you can get out of paying the over baggage fee on all of your camera gear coming out of Iceland is that you can tell them, hey, I've got all this camera gear, all this scuba gear. I sure would love to have a little exception on this $100 fee. In fact, hey, take a look. Here's some kelp that lives right off of the coast. And it'll blow their minds so hard, at least for now, that they'll forget to charge you $100 and then you can move right on. So that's just like a little pro tip. People in Iceland have no idea, writ large, have no idea that they have forests underwater off the shore. It's just not part of the zeitgeist. There's not a lot of people diving there. It's not that people don't know, oh yeah, no, there's kelp out there. Of course there's kelp. They know that there's kelp washes up on the beach, but that same visceral reaction that you may have with your friends when you say, hey, here's this photo from underwater right out here in my favorite kelp, blows their mind to see it. And so this is some Icelandic kelp. This is very similar to what you'll find off of Norway, Scotland, Ireland, the Faroe Islands, off northern coasts of Russia, and similar to stuff that you end up finding. Well, it basically ends right before Greenland. But so just imagine that whole northern part of Europe that you're used to seeing on the map, British Isles, Scotland, Ireland, etc., like I just mentioned, it's got kelp, just like this, underwater. There's a few different types. There's red algae. There's some dulse in there. This is Laminaria hyperborea, I believe. And then zooming in, it looks very similar to another type of kelp that we have out here called Laminaria seychellii. But again, here's kelp underwater in Iceland. Not a sunflower star, but a sun star out there chowing down on stuff in this seaweed jungle. This is north of the Arctic Circle in Iceland. You've got 3 different types of algae there. We've got some laminaria, some alaria, and then some red algae there in the center. I believe that's some dulse as well. But look at that. That's just a field of kelp. On the right is my dive buddy to give you a sense. It grows over 10 feet tall, but it starts from the seafloor. So if you're dropping down 20 feet, you've got nothing, and then you hit the kelp, and then you've got another 10 feet to go. This is sort of a view looking back up. And then it's habitat for so many animals, from these Icelandic cod, the red cod here, apparently a climate change variant of cod that is starting to come in more with warmer water. Here's a sole, flounder out swimming along. So if you enjoy Icelandic cod, if you enjoy eating sole from the North Atlantic, it's part of the kelp cult as well. There's jellies out there too. Here's a moon jelly with very, very warbly. Whoa, it's doing a weird animation I didn't plan on. With really warbly seaweed on the background, and it's shimmery like that because of all the fresh water that's coming in from that big waterfall there in the background. Zooming in here, that's the Dunyandi waterfall. So if you're on TikTok and you've seen people dancing in front of a waterfall in Iceland, there's a good chance it was here. And so all those people are out there doing their influencer stuff, and then right offshore is seaweed and little kelp forests out there. This is a similar type of kelp to what you find on our shoreline. It's like Sylvicia that we have out here, a rockweed, I should say. And then a quick aside, I won't get too much into it, but here's a sun star that is crawling atop a very special type of seaweed forest. It's almost a coral reef, but it's made out of red algae that are forming a little calcareous skeleton, the coralline algae. So this is called a merle bed, very, very well known in Northern Europe. And if I zoom out here, maybe you can see all the little pink trees that are kind of in there. Those are all coralline algae that form tall little mounds and eventually snap off and roll around and pile up and create merle beds, rhodolith beds that basically form the same type of structure as a giant kelp forest, but in a miniature way. And these things take thousands, if not millions of years to grow up. People have harvested the merle for lime for a very, very long time, but super important bit, like very, very rare, slow growing. This is like old, old, old. Maybe the analogy, these are the bristlecone pines of seaweed forests, is these merle beds where they grow so slow. And this is off of an island in Iceland that people are trying to put oh, I can zoom in. People are trying to put a salmon farm in this habitat that would absolutely destroy this merle bed. So this is part of work that we're doing to try to help conserve the areas. Like, hey, you can put that farm hopefully nowhere, but if you have to, elsewhere. So anyway, quick little aside, shout out to the rhodolith heads who already knew what I was talking about. And then here we have Greenland. So now we've left that part of Northern Europe that's temperate, And now we're into the Arctic. This is north of the Arctic Circle off of Sissamute in Greenland. And it's kelp, it's urchins, it's nudibranchs, naked gill sea slugs. Remind anybody of anything? Pretty much what we have in our backyard as well. This is a type of kelp called agarum or sieve kelp. It's got all those little holes in there. And then that's a type of dendronotus, which we have out here as well. So this rhymes with everything that we have in our backyard out there in Greenland. And speaking of rhyming, everybody remembers the cabezon from way back, right? Look at that thing. That's a Greenlandic sculpin. It basically looks exactly like a cabezon, but it's its own thing, but it's one of the most common fish that you'll find in the sieve kelp up there in the agarum. And they have this really beautiful patterning on them. They just sit right there in the kelp, ready to gather stuff. But they've got all these little polka dots on them. They've got white spots all over them. And I believe that to be very good camouflage because here is a photo that I took where the flash went through the holes and gave it extra little polka dots on its face. And so you can see here the coloration and patterning on this fish is perfect for hiding out inside these little holy bits of kelp. So if I think that the kelp forest is my kelp cathedral, this fish is on a wholly other level. Get it? All right, that was a 46-minute pun in there just to like wake anybody up or put them fully in bed. Okay. So anyway, these Greenlandic sculpins out hiding out on the algae here is, again, north of the Arctic Circle. It's anemones, it's kelp, but look in the background. You see those very, very long, dangly kelps? Those are what we're calling lasagna kelps. I forget exactly the genus, but you find the same thing in Antarctica where these kelps create 30, 40 feet long strips of kelp that go from the sunlit surface and then dangle down into the dark. Here I'm about 80 feet deep taking this photo. I don't know how much growth is happening from the depths out here. Fairly clear water in the Arctic, but there can also be a lot of blooms. Here's a Arctic sea star hiding out on top of some kelp. And then on the sieve kelp are these fun little friends. These are called starozoans. I won't linger too long, but that is a jellyfish that attaches itself to kelp. It is not an anemone. It is actually a full-grown adult jellyfish that has a little butt sucker, and it suctions on to the kelp and it whips around like a murderous chandelier to gather up little bits of food. And starozoans are an animal after mine own heart. They are only found in temperate waters and north. They don't go to the tropics. So this is, if I'm going to get a tattoo of an animal, one that represents my life and that's only found in the places that I tend to travel, it's probably going to be a starozoan. Because now we're jumping from Greenland way the heck down into Patagonia. Hey, look at our little friend. See it? Recognize the giant kelp? Recognize our little jellyfish friend there? That's starozoan. It's going to zoom in here. Voila. Look at that. So the kelp down here off of Patagonia, and this is Isla de los Estados, that the Dutch named Staten Island. This is the last island that's basically the Andes before the Andes disappear into the Atlantic. The giant kelp there is covered in these things. They are some of my favorites. And maybe you'll invite me back for another talk about other things. This is a comb jelly that I saw around this kelp forest. This particular comb jelly turns out to be a brand new species of comb jelly, and we figured that out thanks to this photo zooming in. We were able to find new features of this comb jelly that confirmed that it's its own thing. So I'm going to call this the albatross comb jelly because it's got these big wings on it, the biggest wings of any comb jelly that we know, but it lives associated with these kelp forests. And here, it's one of the wildest kelp forests I ever got to dive in because there were all these bogs around and it had rained. And so there's all this peat water that was washing out into the kelp and it turned everything this matrix green, crazy colors. And again, this is Patagonia. There's the ship that I work on in the background there. More kelp. Then, kelp is not a recent phenomenon to be involved with. And to prove it to you, I mean, you can talk to any of the indigenous peoples up and down the coast, all the way around the world, they've been involved with kelp. That cross is where Magellan held his first Catholic mass in the Straits of Magellan back in 15 something. And right off of that point is a giant kelp forest. So that cross was put in by the Chilean government. They didn't actually have that huge cross with lights and everything back in Magellan's day. Would have changed their whole paradigm, I think. But right there, where they first landed in South America, the first Europeans to make their way through the Straits of Magellan landed there. They held a mass, and then right next to it was a kelp forest. So, same kelp forest that Darwin would end up writing about later. Here's a king crab in a kelp forest inside a fjord in Chilean Patagonia. Here's me pandering to the South American sea lions. Whoa! That also come and visit us in the kelp. And then here is a South American South American giant octopus, not a giant Pacific octopus, but the converse one that you find down there. So if you've seen giant Pacific octopuses in your area in the kelp, same things going on off of Chile. Here's in the Falkland Islands, which has been a kelp refugia forever. That is not a sunflower star, but you recognize the theme, right? You've got here a sticky, smooth raid, or sorry, a sticky, fragile raid star, Labidaster. And it's out there cruising around, eating things, moving fast, as all these multi-armed stars do. And it's living on top of tree kelp, which is its own thing, but that you find off of South Africa and other places. Lawsoniana. So you've got these tree kelps in the Falklands. But then you also have giant kelp. This is my attempt at doing the Windows XP background with kelps and rolling hills and the blue sky. Here's giant kelp, and the giant kelp down there has something that we don't have, which is a whole bunch of mussels, or a type of mussel that live on top of the kelp as well. So this is in a very silty backwater. So we might have dirty kelp covered in bryozoans, moss animals that cover them up, the white stuff. Here we actually have basically clam mussel hybrids living on top of the kelp. And then we sometimes have little big friends that come by to say hello. There's a big South American sea lion that pinned us to the seafloor on one of our dives. So the Falklands have been sort of the seeding ground for giant kelp in that Southern Ocean hemispheric current for a long time, apparently, according to the recent research. The Falklands are kind of like the depository of kelp for everywhere else. And some of that everywhere else is Antarctica. I apologize. Yes, these are penguins. There's no kelp in this image, but look at the penguins with their little bubbles coming out of them. So in Antarctica, there is kelp. This is South Georgia, the most Antarctica that's still technically Antarctica, but is almost not Antarctica. This is where Shackleton is buried, is at Grytviken, if you're familiar with Shackleton, Endurance, everything. So South Georgia was this outpost. It's inside the Antarctic convergence, so it is Antarctic water, but it's pretty far north. It's like 800 miles off the peninsula. So very different habitat here. This is where all the elephant seals go, where the whalers were hanging out, where all the whalers told Shackleton, hey, don't go to the Weddell Sea this time of year. There's a lot of ice. And then a year later saw him back here like, oh, dang, dude, you've been through a little something in that last year. But so there's giant kelp right off of Shackleton's grave in Grytviken. Here's some giant kelp in Fortuna Bay, which is where he begins his across South Georgia hike. There was kelp there. This is Durvalea, New Zealand bull kelp, they call it, or cachoyuyo, that is used in Chile and Argentina as a way of preserving foods, and beautiful kelp. Giant kelp, red algae, South Georgia. And then there's our staurozoan again, a jellyfish living on red algae. This is in South Georgia. And then just a month ago, I was on the Antarctic Peninsula. This is a photo off of Peterman Island, where Commandant Charcot was in 1904 and 1908. And if I didn't tell you that was Antarctica, where could that be? I mean, you've got a sea star on the right that looks like an ochre star. You've got a sea cucumber in the middle. That's the same genus as what we have out here in California. There's sponges and bryozoans and red algae and coralline algae. And then there's little amphipods that are growing on the kelp, or growing, that are living on the kelp. I mean, if I didn't tell you that was Antarctica, it could be anywhere in the cold water realm. I knew that I wasn't just anywhere because the water on this particular dive was 29 degrees. So that was a little chilly. And then here's my buddy Emmett with the lasagna kelp. Again, 40 plus feet long blades of algae, but and then look at that. I mean, where is that? That looks like a bat star, looks like some sponge, looks like some kelp, but that is actually Odont aster, the toothed star of Antarctica. But Antarctica Peninsula, it's got kelp on it. It also has hiding out inside the seaweeds these wild animals that are the Antarctic giant isopod, massive lobster-sized cockroachy thing that loves to hang out on the kelp. Um, that's a real thing that you share the planet with, folks. And then where the ice goes, it'll scour everything. But then some of the first things to come back from when the ice is scouring are little bits of kelp, these and red algae. So you got some ectocarpales, some red algae. That's just right off of a penguin colony. Here's some acid weed, or Desmarestia, as it's called. Some of you also may remember acid weed from back in the 60s at Grateful Dead concerts. It was slightly different than this photo. Sorry, had to throw in another egregious pun. Keep myself awake. There we go, acid weed. Yeah, so seaweed all over and at the end of the world. Okay, in these last 5 minutes, Northern California. Here we are. This is taken right off of Portuguese Beach, or Big River Beach. And you can see how silty it is maybe in the water from the outflow. But we've got in the background some feather boa kelp. Then we have the alaria that I mentioned, not the eularia, but alaria that's wrapping itself around the bull kelp. Beautiful seaweed scene on a pinnacle that's just right off the beach there at Big River. Same area, dancing bull kelps. I mean, one of the most satisfying things to take photos of. Absolutely sumptuous. And then this is probably the thing that you're most seeing in the news is these types of images of our large red sea urchins with a bare backdrop. The story of the urchins coming in to eat the kelp is very, very complicated. We don't have time to go into it, but just know that in our area off the coast of California, this idea that you have these marauding hordes of hungry purple panzers, basically, that are just mowing through and eating stuff. This is off of Portuguese Beach. This is taken from the urchin perspective, looking into the kelp. This is from the kelp's perspective, looking back at the urchins. They move. They eat everything that they can, and they're unchecked at the moment without their predators of the sunflower stars, of the sea otters, of just they're unchecked. They're on the move. And this is what you end up getting on the reef after they move through. Coral and algae is still there, some chitons, a few limpets, not a whole lot. This is what the urchin barren is. This is what we're trying to not have happen, but has happened for hundreds and hundreds of miles of coastline. And all around the world, you have similar scenes, not the same dynamic. Again, very different kelp forests everywhere, but similar scenes in a lot of areas. It wasn't an iceberg that came through and scraped off the rock like you saw in those images in Antarctica. The slow-moving threat there were the sea urchins. But then there's a lot of crafty people along this coast, a lot of people trying to keep the kelp current. And this, look at that, little island in the sky of some kelp growing off of what's called an archev. Right now I'm blanking on exactly what the archev means, but it's like the aerial kelp vehicle. We're bringing the kelp off the seafloor up into the water column where the urchins can't get at it, and you can grow kelp forests in the water column. This is off of Albion in Mendocino. This is the exact type of thing that's going to be going on at Portuguese Beach in Mendocino. The Nature Conservancy, Sonoma State, Moss Landing Marine Labs, so many different groups, UC Santa Cruz, they're all involved with getting this stuff going, and there will be these things deploying in massive areas along the coast of Mendocino, or, massive compared to none, but will continue to grow and hopefully help this massive area get some of its kelp back. Because if you have kelp around, it will seed the reef and hopefully you have wild kelp growing back. If you have no kelp, you have no spores, you have nothing growing. So these are all photos of kelp that are basically homegrown, human mediated. There's that little shrimp hanging out on the bulb of bull kelp. This is looking down at that same one. Look at that. Off of the reef, up in the water column, a little miniature kelp forest as a part of this scientific experiment. There's some humans for scale. Some of the humans involved with this are my friends Andrew Kim. Here we are releasing lab grown, homegrown, maricultured algae into the wild. These kelps were consumed minutes later by hungry urchins, so we learned that you can't just put the kelp on the reef. Turns out you can grow the kelp if it's on these little cables or these little lines that we had out there. That's where the kelp was growing and the urchins couldn't get to them. That's Tristan McHugh, the kelp program manager over at the Nature Conservancy off of Albion. She's looking at that kelp. Look, that's an idea forming right there. And boom, there's little baby kelps that were growing on lines out in the water column. So if you've learned that kelp is global and everywhere and important and a part of communities that maybe you hadn't considered yet, also know that kelp is being worked on by lots of people in your backyard, trying to keep these forests as lush and beautiful as they have been for generations. This is another video from Monastery Beach in my backyard. We don't want this scene anymore along the coast, and we're working to try to get it back. Let's see. I can probably skip over. Yes. So in Mendocino, there's the beginnings of hope with this little sunflower star that was seen in a tide pool starting to come back in. There was a sunflower star filmed in 2017, 4 years after we thought all the sunflower stars had gone extinct in Monterey Bay. And so we've got the Sunflower Star Lab. We've got these people working on kelp forest restoration. There's a lot of places. If you have funds, resources, time, energy, volunteer hours, whatever you have, you can donate it to the coast. There's a global kelp restoration guidebook that features a photo of mine from California. California is really at the center of a lot of this work. And I just want to thank you so much for going around the world with me in kelp. I think we have time for questions, but here's my camera. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Ruth put a question in earlier that about the warm current flows on the south side of Iceland, and she was curious
Yeah.
if that's where you were diving.
Yeah, so that warm current is what makes it so different in Iceland than Greenland. Where we were diving was on the northern coast of Iceland, so a little bit shaded from that warm current that ends up flowing up usually off of the west coast of, or the east coast of Iceland. But very temperate. It was, I think, 42-degree water compared to Greenland, which is 36 and below when I was diving there, like 38. There's
Hmm.
a front in the Strait of Greenland that is similar to the Antarctic front, where once you cross it, you're like, okay, now we're in the Arctic. It's a very different water.
I'm curious about your equipment and how much it weighs. I mean, it looks massive. I know underwater is a lot different than carrying it on land, but could you tell us a little bit about that?
Whoa, I think there's music playing right now. Sorry about that, everybody. Okay. Um, so the equipment that I have, the camera weighs a little bit over 30 pounds. When I have all of the camera stuff in my carry-on, it weighs a little bit over 55 pounds. And so on the planes, I never let anybody touch that so that they don't realize how much of an overage I have in there. But I do try to
Hmm.
make sure to lift everyone else's bags into the overhead so that I gain enough karma that no one really questions too much. But it's very, very heavy when it's out of the water, but in the water, it is pretty much neutrally buoyant. It
Hmm.
kind of just hovers right there. Um, yeah, so the equipment itself costs more than my car by a lot, which is why I have up here on screen this little QR code. You can email me if you have any questions. Divemola.com is my web store. I sell photo prints and calendars and things over there as well. But over at the Underwater Pack QR code there, I also have links to PayPal and Venmo and other things. Mainly share that with friends of yours who know who have got some money to blow. But underwater photographers be struggling out here, choosing between various lenses and then whether or not you get the discount produce from the grocery store. So but yeah, it's quite expensive. I have a Sony A1 camera. So it can film 4K at 120 frames per second, and it also has a very big photo sensor, so it kind of does the best of both worlds. Most of my job with Nat Geo is video based, where I make a video presentation at the end of my day of diving to share with the guests on the ship, and then I take photos on the side to do slideshows or presentations like this one. But yeah, lots of photos and videos and everything with the camera.
Good. And more compliments and thank yous. And there was a question from Ruth who wanted to know, do you think sea otters could be helpful in restoring the kelp on the North Coast if they were imported?
Yeah, so sea otters are a normal part of the kelp forest ecosystem of the North Coast historically, but they haven't been on the North Coast for hundreds of years now because of the fur trade. So um, one of the things that I encourage everybody to think about is like uh, and this will go on way too long, but basically the wilderness paradigm of John Muir, of Teddy Roosevelt, of our national parks, of marine protected areas that we kind of had this philosophy around for like over 100 years on land, and then within the last 40 to 50 years in the ocean. This premise that if you leave it alone, it'll preserve itself, and its human impact on the environment that is the bad thing, or human involvement in the environment that is the quote bad thing that ruins wilderness, and that if you just leave it alone, then it'll recover and manage itself. That paradigm doesn't never really existed because it forgets that humans have been a part of their ecosystem the whole time. And so what we saw as wilderness, as a civilization moving across the land, was actually human mediated gardens, basically from the Great Plains to the forests in the Sierras to the ocean. In a very big way, we've always made our ecosystem, our environment around us support us more. So with that said, having a heavy hand as humans to have kelp forests in our backyard is something that is within our kind of tradition along the coast. And you can have thriving kelp forests with heavy human involvement with sea otters like we have in California, also without them as we repopulate the coast. And as otters increase their area, you don't necessarily have to release them into various places where they don't have a good habitat. Sea otters really need a garden to garden, if that makes sense. Where they show up, if there is no kelp, it's not like you have a sea otter, then suddenly there will be kelp there. And so to start to think of our little coastal communities as our own little community gardens. And so some players will be there, some players won't be. If you're in Alaska, you might have one thing. If you're in Chile and Patagonia, you'll have another thing. In Chile and Patagonia, the most important thing to preserve their kelp forests is to get rid of the salmon farms and industries that are coming in. That's very different than us, where we have this collapse of kelp forests. And so, yes, sea otters absolutely will help a kelp forest that is there because they've been a part of it, but also humans choosing to have kelp there for human industry, for urchin harvesting, for abalone, for whatever, that can also be the local solution. It basically means that we all want kelp, and there's different places and different areas to have maximum kelp, if that makes sense. Because obviously, in a natural, quote, natural normal system, there's otters out there, except we know that the local people hunted the otters as well, and maybe over harvested otters like we've seen in the Aleutians and other places. So there's no perfect static kelp forest that we are managing towards. There is only our continued desire to have kelp forest in our backyard that is the driving force of restoration, of getting everybody out there. Because if you leave it alone, climate change, historical overfishing and harvesting of sea otters, of abalone, of urchins, vagaries of the coast, fire, storms, all these things attack our perfect vision of having kelp out there. And it's maybe normal for there not to be kelp forests for decades in certain areas, but that's not what we want. What we want is vibrant, healthy, robust kelp. And I think we should allow ourselves as people to say, we get to have these gardens, we should have these kelps because we can't wait 100 years for it to fix itself, especially knowing that climate change will continue on in its warming and energy input into the ocean, regardless of if we stop tomorrow or in 40 years. We need to get involved, and we want kelp, and it can mean with otters or without otters. You can do it if you commit the kelp to be part of your local garden.
Sophia asks for someone that wants to do exactly what you do, underwater photography, marine education, a nomadic lifestyle. What are some recommendations you would make to gain valuable skills and experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So shortly, try to keep it short. Shortly, you'll want to get experience with a lot of different methodologies of being on the ocean. So that can mean sailing, being a boat captain, um, expedition leading, all these various things that make you really, really useful in various places. You could be a marine technician, like there's all these various things where you can get involved to be on ships, to be in harbors, to be moving around. I, for example, didn't really know much about the world of Lindblad and National Geographic. I had the background in marine science education from working at aquariums. You could also look at, museum education, aquariums, but basically you want to stack up as many different things that make you really good at being in these situations of being far from home and far from places. So I'm an expert, I guess now I can say that truthfully, in cold water diving. So dry suits, dry gloves, H valves, scientific diving, camera operating, like all these things, and having that in your quiver, then all around the world are places that are looking for those types of skill sets, and they're actually more rare than you would maybe think. And then the main thing, I think, around science communication, one of the things I've noticed is that science communication has kind of been this, it has become this thing of like, science communication is people sharing their science with other scientists or like a scientific group, like an in group. Science communication to me is just it's a style of, or it's like a thesis when you're talking to anybody. And so if you want to work with a lot of different audiences, just start talking to people about science without saying, hey, hi, I'm a science communicator and I'm going to tell you about science, because everything that's going on underwater along the shore is relevant to somebody's life. And I've talked a lot, as you can see, to a lot of different people, and just talk, communicate, and have the topic be something scientific. Don't get locked in the SciComm bubble of, I'm just going to talk within this sort of in group, because they're right now at a bar somewhere along the shore are fishermen or tourists that are there, and they are intimately tied to the kelp, and maybe they've never had anybody talk to them about kelp, and maybe the only time they've heard about it is in some climate change packet or exhibit somewhere. Kelp should be as easy to talk about with other people as the weather eventually along the coast would be the hope. So I hope that helps.
Great, thank you. We have one more question from Jim Roth, who asked, what about introducing giant kelp to our more protected coves?
Yeah, I think kelp kelp will go where kelp will go if there's an ocean that supports kelp, and if there's a benthos that supports kelp. So you can do a lot. I mean, kelp and urchins are locked on our coastline. They're locked in a death match where nobody, they're each their perfect foil. Like kelp will grow everywhere it can. If it's given an inch, it'll take multiple feet in a day. And sea urchins can live for maybe over 100 years for red urchins with no food for years, um, in the zombie-like state. So it's almost like they're their perfect yin and yang, the fastest growing thing, the immortal thing, and they're just locked in this battle. And you need to have various referees, like the sunflower stars, like sea otters in many contexts, um, like cold water, like you need all these things to level that playing field, and we can play a big part in helping the kelp get there. Because if it has good conditions, it'll grow, and those conditions can be with growing it away from the urchins, with seeding it, with removing urchins. There's all these various ways to get it done, and each location, each cove might even be different. But if you can create circumstances for kelp to grow, it will. And that's one of the cool things is we learned you can't just put kelp on rocks because the urchins will eat it. But if kelp is growing naturally just off of the bottom on its little kelp ropes, which we hadn't even planned, it just was growing naturally on the kelp. As far as I know, it wasn't planned. Um, the kelps are just moving around, can't get grabbed by the urchins. And then now we have this new paradigm for how to grow kelp away from the urchins. So we have enough, we have the technology to do this right now. So there's probably the technology to figure out how to beat the urchins a little bit at their game and help the kelp. Because we're, as people, definitely on team kelp. We're not anti-urchin. They need to be out there. They're critical for lots of different things, but people are definitely team kelp. And so we can try to kick some balls forward for some assists or do some chest passes, whatever your favorite sports analogy is. Football's coming up. Nice little Hail Mary to the kelp. It'll catch it in the end zone if it's got a chance. Thanks, everybody.